The first thing I remember was the milk. Still on the table lid, flipped open like someone had paused mid-pour and never came back. The sun had already warmed the clearing, but that milk hadn't curdled yet. It hadn't been long. There were no sounds, no shouts, no dragging footprints. Just a campsite full of life food toys, diapers without a single person in sight. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from, down in the comments. And tap that like and subscribe if stories like this ever brushed past your hometown or your own life. Every click helps pull another forgotten name back into the light. My name's Karen McBride. I'm 42 now, and I've lived in White Pine, Oregon nearly my whole life. Back in '74, my husband Gary and I had just moved into a small one-story house about 3 blocks from the Daltons. Rick worked long hours driving logging trucks through the mountains. Jenny stayed home with the kids, David and baby Lena. You'd see her out early pushing that old stroller along Applewood Lane, waving at folks she barely knew. Quiet, polite, kept to herself mostly, but kind. Rick was the type to change your tire without asking. He'd nod instead of talk, but if you needed help moving a couch or hauling firewood, he was already on his way before you finished the sentence. They didn't have much, just that old red pickup a swing in the front yard, and a backyard patch where David played with the neighbor kids. But they were solid. That summer, they were more settled than ever. Jenny had just turned 23, and she'd finally gotten a little ahead on the grocery money. I remember she baked banana bread and brought some over wrapped in a dish towel. Said she'd gotten the recipe from her mother, wanted to share. That's just the kind of woman she was. Every few weeks, Rick would get a long weekend off, and they'd head out to Carberry Creek to camp. Same spot every time, off a bend in the trail near the tree line, just where the sound of the water picked up again. Rick loved to fish, and David would toss rocks until his arms were sore. Jenny packed egg salad sandwiches, a jug of lemonade, sometimes homemade cookies. They didn't bring much, just a tent, some folding chairs, and the dog, but they didn't need more. That Labor Day weekend started the same as all the others. I saw them loading up on Friday, David clutching his toy airplane, Jenny waving goodbye with her baby on her hip. Buddy barked from the truck bed, full of energy. I didn't think much of it. Why would I? They always came back by Sunday night tired, but smiling, sunburned, and happy. But this time, Monday came. Then Tuesday. No truck in the driveway. No Jenny pushing the stroller. No sign of David chasing the neighbor's cat through the hedge. It wasn't until Wednesday morning that her mother showed up at my door, eyes wide, holding a half-folded paper grocery list she said Jenny left behind. She said, "Karen, something's wrong." They didn't show up for dinner, and she wasn't the type to worry without a reason. We drove out there that afternoon. I still remember how quiet the woods were when we stepped into the clearing, like the trees were holding their breath. Rick's truck was parked just off the road like always. The fire pit was cold but tidy, picnic basket still open, milk still on the table, and the dog still tied to the tree. But no sign of the family, not a single one of them, not even footprints. The moment I saw the leash still tied to that tree, I knew something wasn't right. Buddy wasn't barking, just sitting there like he'd been waiting for hours, confused, quiet eyes, shifting back and forth like he expected someone to come walking out of the trees. I knelt beside him, loosened the knot, and scratched behind his ears. He didn't wag his tail. He just leaned against my leg like he needed something to hold on to. Rick's truck was parked the same way it always was, driver's side, facing the trail, not an inch off from where he usually left it. The bed still had his fishing rod and tackle box strapped down. The keys were on the floorboard. Jenny's purse was sitting open on the passenger seat, her wallet inside zipped up. There was a pack of cigarettes tucked into the side pocket. Her brand, I recognized it. Nothing was missing, nothing stolen. But nobody was there. No sound of children laughing, no baby fussing, no pots rattling over a morning fire. Just quiet. That thick, wooded kind of quiet that makes you feel like the trees are holding their breath. Belinda. That's Jenny's mother, was already walking the perimeter of the site when I got there. She didn't look panicked. She looked stunned. She had a sweater wrapped tight across her chest, like she'd left the house in a hurry, which she had. She told me later she was expecting them to stop by for dinner the night before. They were supposed to come straight from the creek, just like they always did. She had potatoes roasting when she realized it was already dark and no headlights had pulled up. She said she waited until morning, thinking maybe they'd stayed one more night out here. But when she saw the truck still parked, she felt it before she saw anything. Something had stopped them. We circled the campsite together. The cooler was out, half unzipped. There were sandwiches still in wax paper, untouched. The baby's bottle was resting near the fire ring, a little crust of milk dried around the rim. Lena's diaper bag was there too, unzipped, but full clean diapers, a pacifier, even her teething ring still tucked in the side. There were no torn clothes, no signs of a struggle. Just a stillness that didn't make sense. I called Gary from the ranger station. He was working 2 towns over, wouldn't be back until late. The officer on duty that morning was a young guy, maybe mid-20s. Didn't know the family. When I told him what we'd seen, he looked unsure whether to log it as a welfare check or something more. Said maybe they just walked off for a bit. But Jenny wouldn't have left that baby alone for a second, not in these woods. And Rick? He wouldn't have left his truck unlocked unless something had yanked him out of routine. They sent out a few state troopers by early afternoon, but it wasn't until the sheriff came through later that the tone started to shift. Sheriff Emmett, a tall, sunburned man with a careful way of speaking, walked the site in silence. Didn't touch a thing. Then he muttered something under his breath. Even the milk's still cold, and turned to one of the deputies to start the paperwork. That's when I knew they were treating it like a disappearance. Not a delay, not a misunderstanding. Something was wrong. By the next morning, they had dogs out. Bloodhounds. They brought in men from the Forest Service and even pulled in a chopper to fly overhead with thermal gear. I watched them spread out in teams, marking trees with colored tape, calling names that didn't echo back. I stood with Belinda near the creek and listened to the wind move through the trees, but there was no sound of footsteps, no cries for help. They covered 30 miles in 3 days. Nothing. No footprints, no drag marks, no scent trails that went anywhere at all. I remember a deputy named Carlson telling me the site looked too clean, like it had been frozen in time. He said it was the strangest thing he'd seen in 15 years. Even when people run, they leave something behind, some kind of direction. But not this time. Rumors started not long after. Folks said maybe they'd run off tired of the bills, the quiet town, maybe chasing something bigger. But Jenny had just planted carrots in the garden. Rick had taken on an extra haul the week before. They weren't the running kind. Belinda kept pointing that out to anyone who'd listen. Said her daughter had packed enough formula for 2 days, no more. Said she left the grocery list for Monday's delivery on the kitchen table. You don't plan meals if you're planning to vanish. Another theory floated around was a bear. But the ranger told us there hadn't been bear sightings near Carberry Creek in over 6 months. And even if one had wandered through, it wouldn't have taken all 4 of them without leaving a trail. And it wouldn't have tied the dog up afterward. The search went on for weeks. Helicopters buzzed overhead, and volunteers from nearby towns walked every trail. Kids who'd gone to school with Rick helped map the slopes. Even old men who could barely hike anymore came out with walking sticks and packed lunches, hoping maybe they'd spot something the dogs missed. But the woods gave nothing back. Belinda stayed in town, checking in with the sheriff every morning. She kept a little notebook writing down every date, every name, every place they searched. She started to look smaller as the weeks dragged on. Her voice thinned, her movement slowed, but her eyes never lost that fixed, determined look. By late October, the effort was officially scaled back. Still open, but no longer active. That's how they phrased it. The sheriff came by our place to explain. I remember the way he stood on the porch, hat in hand, and said he was sorry. That they'd done all they could. That sometimes the land just keeps its own. But I couldn't let go of it. That dog hadn't barked. That milk hadn't spoiled. And somewhere out past the last search grid, the wind still moved through those trees like it knew something we didn't. Then in April, 7 months later, 2 boys hiking along the ridge spotted something near a rock face. They weren't looking for anyone, just gold. But what they found brought everything back. And it wasn't just one body. It was all of them, hidden, placed. As if someone had waited, as if someone had known exactly how long it would take for the rest of the world to forget. The day the news hit the local papers, I remember standing in line at the grocery store with a bag of flour in one hand and an envelope of coupons in the other. The clerk, older woman named Rita, leaned across the counter and said, "They're still gone, huh?" Her voice didn't rise above a whisper like the words themselves could tip something off balance. I nodded once, said I'd just seen Belinda the day before. She was barely sleeping, hadn't eaten much in days. Her front porch light stayed on all night, and she kept the baby's room just the way Jenny left it. It had been nearly a month since the search had started, and already people were moving on, at least on the outside. Inside that house, nothing had moved forward. Not one bit. The sheriff's office was stretched thin, and I don't blame them. They brought in everyone they could: local police, state troopers, forest rangers. Volunteers combed every ravine they could reach without a rope. I remember one man, Craig, someone a logger from up near Agnes, said he'd been through those woods for 30 years and never seen them so quiet. No birds, no rustling, just fog and pine. It was like the forest itself had pressed pause. Even the dogs struggled. They picked up a trail at the edge of the camp, just a faint one, but it didn't lead anywhere. Just drifted off like smoke. They brought in helicopters with heat sensors. No signs. They even looked for fresh burial sites, disturbed earth. Nothing. Rick's fishing rod was still packed in the truck bed line, coiled neat, untouched. Jenny's purse still held $21 in cash. David's little red tennis shoes were still tucked under the picnic bench. That's what made it so hard for people to believe. It didn't look like a crime scene. It looked like a moment frozen mid-breath. But the longer it went on, the more the whispers started. Not just from strangers or the folks who didn't know the Daltons that well. Even some of the regulars at the diner began wondering aloud. Maybe Rick snapped. Maybe something went wrong in his head. A man carrying that much weight working nights barely home. 2 small kids. Maybe he cracked. I remember sitting across from Belinda when that first started to circle. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She just folded her hands in her lap and stared at the kitchen floor. Then she said, if he were going to hurt someone, he'd have started with himself. Rick was tired, not cruel. Others leaned into different fears. The idea that maybe something wild had come down from the hills. A bear, maybe. Or a mountain lion. The area around Carberry Creek wasn't known for attacks, but fear makes people stretch for answers. The rangers looked into it, tracked scat paw prints, fur, whatever they could find. Nothing matched. No blood, no claw marks, and even if something had come through, it wouldn't have spared the dog tied to that tree for who knows how long. A bear wouldn't have been that neat, that deliberate. What I remember most from that time was how people wanted the explanation to be simple. Clean. Something they could put a label on and walk away from. But there wasn't anything clean about this. A family was gone. Just gone. And nobody wanted to sit with what that might actually mean. When I brought it up to Officer Wilkins, he was younger, had only been on the force 3 years, he said, "Sometimes people disappear because they want to." I told him Jenny had left a roast in the freezer. Diapers still in the bag from the store. Rick had just paid the gas bill early, and David had a checkup scheduled that Tuesday. People planning to vanish don't leave everything so settled. Still, the department had to go down every road, so they looked into Rick's background. No history of violence, no criminal record. He'd gotten into a minor fender bender back in '71, but nothing beyond that. He passed his CDL checks, always showed up for shifts, even picked up routes others turned down when gas prices started climbing. Jenny had never filed a single report, no calls to the house for noise or domestic issues. Their landlord said they were ideal tenants, paid on time, never left so much as a nail in the wall without permission. By the 3rd week, the department turned its attention to the possibility of foul play from outside the family. A stranger passing through. A drifter. There'd been sightings, folks claimed. A man seen near the general store with a southern accent. A woman filling up at the Shell station wearing a coat too heavy for the season. Tips came in daily, and almost all were wrong. One even claimed to have seen David walking with a man along the road to Medford. The police followed up. Turned out to be another boy, same height, wrong shoes. The worst part for Belinda was how quickly people stopped checking in. At first, the phone rang all day, neighbors offering to bring food, help organize flyers, watch the dog. But after the 2nd month, the calls slowed. People didn't know what to say. And saying the wrong thing started to feel worse than saying nothing. I still came by every morning, brought her coffee, sat with her while she flipped through old photo albums she didn't really look at. She'd hold Lena's baby sock in her palm, like she could still feel the warmth in it. Then she'd fold it back into the drawer without a word. Detective Arlo Raines was brought in from Grants Pass to lead the case. He was older, the kind of man who always carried a small notebook and never interrupted you when you spoke. I only met him once, but he left an impression. Calm eyes, methodical voice. He said they weren't closing anything, not yet. That some cases take time. That the land can keep its secrets for a while, but not forever. He didn't promise anything. Just said they'd keep looking. By early November, the flyers started to curl from rain. The search maps were boxed up and filed away. Belinda stopped keeping her notebook updated. There was nothing left to add. We'd walked every path the Daltons might have taken, talked to every person who might have seen something, listened to every theory. And still, all we had was that camp, that truck, that dog. And an ache that kept growing heavier in the absence of anything solid to hold. Then, in the 2nd week of April, 2 boys from Forest Grove set out into the woods with a metal detector and a prospector's shovel. They weren't looking for bodies. They were looking for gold. But what they found on that cold hillside stopped everything. I didn't hear about it right away. Not until the sheriff knocked on Belinda's door, just past sundown. I saw his cruiser from across the street, and I knew. Before he even stepped inside, I knew. Something had been found, but I wasn't ready for how much, or how far it would go. When the sheriff stepped back outside that evening, the porch light behind him threw a soft gold rim around his shoulders. He didn't say much, just nodded once in my direction, then eased the cruiser door closed like he didn't want to disturb the quiet. I knew better than to ask right then. Some news doesn't belong to anyone else until the person inside decides to speak it aloud. I waited until morning. Belinda called just after 6. Her voice was steady more than I expected. She said, "They found them, all 4, not far from the ridge." Then silence. I asked if she wanted me to come over. She said no, just that she'd call again when she could. And then she hung up. I stayed by the window for hours after that coffee cold in my hands, watching the sun rise slow over the tips of the pines. I kept thinking how the light touched the woods the same way it had back in September, as if none of this had ever happened. What we learned in the days that followed didn't come all at once. Bits and pieces, half whispers from people who'd heard from someone who'd heard from someone else. But eventually, the sheriff's office released enough to put a shape around it. 2 teenagers from Forest Grove, both high schoolers, had been hiking just east of Carberry Creek with metal detectors and a couple of old mining maps. Spring runoff had softened the ground, washed some of the loose brush down the hill. They were following a shallow game trail along a slope when they saw something in the brush. A boot partly covered in moss. Then the body. It was Rick, still tied to the base of a pine, weathered, half sunk into the soil. No note, no signs of a scuffle. Just one man's life left out in the open, like whoever put him there wanted him to be found eventually. About 10 yards away, tucked behind a narrow cut in the rock, was the cave. It wasn't a cave in the full sense, more like a rock pocket sheltered tight dry. And inside were the other 3, Jenny, David, little Lena, laid side by side. No blood visible, no struggle, just stillness. The way they'd been placed, the positioning, it didn't feel rushed. That's what investigators said, deliberate. Someone had gone to some trouble. Authorities sealed off the area immediately, brought in pathologists, forensic teams, even a specialist from Salem. But they all said the same thing. Time had passed, too much time. The bodies were mostly bone, but enough remained to tell them what they needed to know. Jenny had been shot once in the chest. David, too, smaller entry wound, same caliber. A .22, they believed. Lena's cause of death was different. Head trauma, blunt force, not immediate. The coroner said it looked like she'd lived a while after it happened. That was the part that sat wrong with me. All of it was terrible, but something about that, the fact that she hadn't died instantly, made the edges of everything harder. And then there was Rick. No gunshot, no visible trauma. His wrists and ankles were bound. His body left upright against the tree. No ligature marks to suggest he'd struggled. They couldn't say for certain, but one officer believed he'd died from exposure. Cold dehydration, maybe even starvation. That would have taken days. It wasn't just the brutality. It was the patience of it. Whoever did this didn't panic. They moved the family 7 miles from the original camp over steep terrain through thick growth. It would have taken time, strength, and the kind of familiarity that doesn't come from a tourist map. The cave itself had been checked during the early search, that much I knew. I remembered when the Forest Service marked that zone as cleared. But now the theory was this: the cave had been empty back then, which meant someone had moved the bodies later, after the dogs had gone, after the helicopters stopped flying overhead, after the community had stopped looking over their shoulders. Detective Rains reopened the investigation with everything they had. He asked to re-interview anyone who'd been in the area around Labor Day. Most agreed. A few couldn't be found. One account stood out early on: a family passing through from Los Angeles had stopped near the trailhead that same weekend. They remembered a pickup parked near the bend, a man and a woman standing beside it along with a third person. Another man, taller, thinner build. The LA father said the group gave him a strange feeling. Said they weren't doing anything overt, just standing there watching. Too still. He'd hurried his own kids along without thinking much of it. But when he saw the story in the paper weeks later, it came back to him. The description didn't match Rick or Jenny, not even close. And the pickup they described had a dented side panel front passenger door deep enough to catch your eye. When police followed up, no plates were recalled. No one knew of any locals with a truck like that, at least not officially. But that detail: 3 people near the trailhead none accounted for, kept coming back. By May, the search had shifted again. Rains brought in new maps, overlaid the known search areas from September against topographical data. He wanted to understand how someone could move 4 people, 2 of them small children, across that kind of terrain without being seen. And more than that, how someone could do it after the fact, after the forest had been combed. He asked one of the original volunteers, a man named Ed Barlow, to walk him through his search route again. Ed had a cabin up near Dry Branch, knew the woods like the back of his hand. He said he'd passed that cave, had looked inside, remembered it clearly. Empty, dry, nothing but old raccoon scat and moss. When they brought him back out, he led them right to the spot. Same shape, same rock lean, same brush coverage. He stood there, looked at the yellow tape, and shook his head. This wasn't here before, he said. I swear to God it wasn't. I drove out later that month. Didn't go near the cave. I wouldn't have stepped off the gravel if you paid me. But I stood at the overlook, stared down toward where the slope dipped, and tried to picture how it all fit together. The way someone must have watched, waited, knew just when to act, and where to hide what they'd done. It didn't feel random. Not anymore. It felt personal. But I didn't say that out loud. Not yet. Not until the next name entered the conversation. And once it did, I couldn't unsee it. The timelines, the silence, the eyes that didn't quite meet yours. It didn't answer everything, but it cracked the quiet wide open. And from there, things started to change. After the cave, after the autopsy reports, after the photographs that no one wanted to see but had to, everything seemed to pause again, like the forest had exhaled and the people had forgotten how. It was early June when the name finally came up. Not from the sheriff's department and not from Detective Rains. It came from a search volunteer named Alan Jeffries. He was retired, used to teach woodshop at the high school, and had joined the original search party back in September. I knew him through Gary. Alan had walked the old mining trails near Bear Hollow, close to where the bodies had turned up. And one afternoon, over coffee, he mentioned something he'd never brought up before. He said the first time he searched that stretch, the cave was empty. He was certain. Not just a passing memory, he described the ridge, the slant of light on the rocks, the field marks he'd chalked with his knife to stay oriented. That cave, he said, had nothing in it but dried leaves and raccoon scat. He'd leaned into the gap, even flashed his light inside. "You don't forget a space like that," he told me. "You don't forget the smell." When I asked him why he hadn't told anyone earlier, he shook his head, said no one had asked him to go back until now. That detail changed everything, because it meant one of two things: either he was wrong, or someone had moved the Daltons' bodies after the search had passed through. That didn't fit with the timeline we'd all clung to. It meant someone had stayed nearby, waited, watched the whole thing play out. And only after the search crews packed up after the flyers yellowed and the headlines changed, only then did they return and put them there. That kind of timing, that awareness, it narrowed the picture. Someone local, someone who knew the land better than the average hiker, and someone who had confidence enough to believe they wouldn't be caught hauling bodies over 7 miles of steep terrain. Rains started revisiting earlier interviews, combing through background checks again. They focused on known offenders with wilderness experience, parolees, former residents with sealed records. That's when the name Dwayne Little resurfaced. I didn't know him personally, but I'd heard stories. He'd grown up in Rogue River, a quiet boy, by most accounts, polite even. But in '64, when he was just 16, he was convicted of raping and murdering a teenage girl from Central Point. Her name was Orla Faye Phipps. It made the papers. Whole region went quiet for a while after that. He was sentenced to prison, but paroled early, something about age and rehabilitation potential. By '74, he was out and supposedly back in the area. There were no official documents putting him near Carberry Creek that weekend. But unofficially, people started remembering things. A kid named Raymond Hall, who'd owned a small hunting cabin up on Marshall Ridge, claimed Dwayne had stopped by that Monday, Labor Day, asking about fishing spots. Said there were 2 others with him, an older woman and a tall man with a limp. They signed the guest book and left before sunset. Raymond said he didn't think anything of it at the time, but after hearing what happened, it stayed with him. The descriptions lined up too closely with the trio seen by the LA family near the trailhead. 2 men, 1 woman. One of the men taller, unsteady on his feet. The pickup truck matched the make and model registered to Dwayne's father. The dent in the passenger side panel that was confirmed by a retired deputy who'd once pulled them over years back for expired tags. Nothing was definitive. Not a fingerprint, not a confession. But the connections started to stack. Then came the part that made my stomach turn. In 1980, 6 years after the Daltons vanished, Dwayne was arrested again, this time for attempting to murder a pregnant woman near Portland. Her name was Margie Hunter. Her car had broken down on a remote road, and he offered to give her a ride. What followed was brutal. She survived, but barely. He was caught, charged, and sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms. That conviction stuck. No appeals, no early release this time. During that investigation, a jailhouse informant named Rusty Kelly came forward. Said Dwayne had talked about another family, years back. Said he'd mentioned a baby that wouldn't stop crying. The authorities noted the statement but didn't pursue charges. Too circumstantial, too distant, too hard to prove. I remember sitting in Belinda's kitchen around then. She'd started leaving the curtains open again. There were newspaper clippings spread out across the table, some folded, some scribbled on. She didn't say much, just traced circles around a paragraph describing the cave. I think she wanted there to be a name, something she could point to. But even as the pieces formed a pattern, the truth stayed just out of reach. The hardest part wasn't the waiting or the lack of closure. It was how easily people started calling it solved, even when nothing had been done. No trial, no formal charges, just a man with a past and a rumor stitched to his name. People said, well, it had to be him. But I've learned not to settle for what had to be. Not when it comes to something like this. Rains didn't give up. He submitted the case again to the state cold case division. DNA testing was still limited back then, but he hoped something might stick. But there was nothing left to test. No weapon recovered, no fibers, no prints. Just dirt time and silence. What struck me most wasn't just that the killer had moved the bodies. It was that they had waited until the rest of us had stopped looking. That detail never let go of me. It meant we were being watched even as we searched. It meant they were close, possibly still are. That summer, the sheriff closed the active investigation. Dwayne Little remained the leading suspect, but without new evidence, there was nothing more they could do. The case file thickened with reports, but the status stayed the same, unresolved. Not cleared, not dismissed, just suspended in time. But every once in a while, something small still surfaced. A phone call, a photograph, a guestbook signature that didn't match the one they remembered. And that's where things turned again. Not dramatically, not loudly, just enough to make someone start digging. Because someone noticed that one of the early witnesses, the man who claimed to have searched the cave, hadn't told the full story. Not at first. And what he left out would change everything. Detective Rains had always carried himself with patience, never rushed, never raised his voice, never claimed to have more answers than he did. But after the interviews started circling back to Ed Barlow, the volunteer who'd first led police to the cave, something in his tone changed. It wasn't open suspicion, not yet. Just a narrowing of focus, the way someone watches a path they've already walked and realizes a turn had been missed. Ed had said from the beginning that he'd searched that cave in September and found it empty. He said he'd crawled in, partway swept the flashlight across the inside, and seen nothing but animal droppings and pine needles. And maybe he had, but by early summer, when Rains pulled the original map of search zones and compared Ed's notes, something didn't fit. Ed had claimed he made it out to that ridge on the second weekend of the search, but the logs placed him down near Crooked Creek those 2 days. That was 20 miles away. I still remember the morning Rains knocked on my door. He didn't look tired exactly, just worn. Like he'd been thinking too hard and sleeping too little. He asked if I still had the volunteer sign-in sheets from back in September. I kept them in a file box near the pantry, mostly out of habit. I handed him the folder and watched as he flipped slowly page by page, index finger tracking the lines. He paused halfway through the second sheet and tapped lightly beside Ed's name. He signed in for the 11th, he said, but the cave wasn't marked as checked until the 14th, and there's no matching signature on that day. I didn't say anything, just stood still while he read the notes a second time. I think he went back, he said finally. After the search was done. The problem was, Ed wasn't a stranger. People trusted him. He'd lived in White Pine most of his life, taught woodshop for nearly 3 decades, fixed broken fence posts for the Park Service after retirement. And to most folks, he didn't seem like the type to hold on to something dark. But Rains wasn't accusing him of the crime. Not directly. What he wanted to know was simpler and harder. Why would Ed lie about when he saw the cave? It took 3 conversations before Ed admitted what he'd left out. He hadn't searched the cave during the official sweep. He'd gone back a month later, alone. Said it was eating at him that he felt like the team had missed something. So one morning in October, he drove out early with his dog and a thermos of coffee parked near the ridge and hiked in from the east trail. He found the cave again, just like before, but this time it wasn't empty. At first, he thought it was trash. Old tarps, maybe. But when he got closer, the smell changed his mind. He didn't go inside, just backed away and left. He didn't tell anyone. Said he panicked. Didn't know what to do. Thought maybe it would be better coming from someone else. But no one else knew. And by spring, when the teenagers found the site again, the story had shifted. In his mind, maybe he believed it would all wash out the same way. The bodies were found. The killer would be caught. What did it matter if he saw them a few months earlier? It mattered. Because if the bodies weren't placed in the cave until after the search, that meant the killer had returned. Had watched the searchers come and go. Had waited. And if Ed had seen them in October, that window narrowed. It also meant something else. Whoever had done this hadn't buried the Daltons deep in the woods. They'd staged them. First moved Rick alone. Tied him, left him, then hid the rest. Quietly, carefully, with enough time to watch for search patterns and know when the forest would go still again. Rains kept pressing. Asked Ed if he'd seen tire tracks, another fire ring, any clothing. Ed said no. Nothing like that. But he did say something odd. On his way back to the car, maybe a half-mile from the ridge, he passed another hiker. Tall man, late 40s, wearing an old army surplus coat and a red kerchief around his neck. They didn't speak, just nodded. The man kept walking. Ed said it gave him a strange feeling, like the man had already known where he was going. When Rains asked for more details, Ed couldn't recall much. Said it was quick. Said the guy didn't have a backpack, just a belt knife and a plastic canteen. No reason to remember it until now. No reason to think twice about it back then. That was the last straw for Rains. He took the full case file back to the State Cold Case Division, requested deeper review. Not just forensics, but behavior movement, environmental modeling. He wanted to know how someone could move 4 people that far, how they could cross uneven terrain without being seen, without damaging the bodies, more than they were without leaving so much as a dropped shoe or torn blanket. The report that came back suggested something chilling. Whoever had done this likely made multiple trips, over several days, in good weather, and had a strong working knowledge of the terrain, its hiding spots, slope grades, seasonal flow. It was someone who didn't just use the forest. They belonged to it. I walked those woods the next week, not to search, just to feel the weight of it. The paths had grown in again like the trees wanted to forget. But the feeling didn't leave. The stillness wasn't peaceful anymore. It was full, like something was holding its breath, waiting to move again. And when I stepped off the trail just once, just to see if I could still hear my own footsteps, I couldn't. Only the wind, only the sound of dry leaves brushing past my boot, like they didn't want to remember either. I stood near the bend where the trail forked, right where Ed said he saw the man with the red kerchief. I didn't expect to find anything. I didn't. But I did remember something I'd heard months earlier, something I hadn't understood at the time. There was a woman, a camper from out of state, who reported hearing a child's cry echoing through the trees sometime in early October. Just one cry. Sharp. Brief. Then, nothing. She assumed it was a coyote or someone playing a joke, but the report was filed. And now, when I thought of that cave, sealed off, silent, hidden, it didn't feel so distant anymore. There's a difference between forgetting and not knowing. The first is passive. The second is a decision. And someone somewhere had decided what we would and wouldn't find. But they'd made one mistake. They hadn't done it all at once. And that gap, that short space between disappearance and discovery, was where the truth still lived. We just hadn't dug deep enough yet. Detective Rains never believed in shortcuts. Even after 2 years on the Dalton case, even with more dead ends than anything you could hang a theory on, he kept going back to the same pieces. The maps, the weather reports, the timing of patrol logs. He said it wasn't about some grand breakthrough, it was about pattern, pressure. People crack in small ways, not big ones. And it was a minor note buried in a field interview that finally caught his attention. One of the early campground witnesses, a woman from Los Angeles, part of the family that had seen the strange trio near the trailhead, had described the woman in the group as wearing a dark green scarf around her head. That didn't seem important at the time, but now, months later, when he read back through the statement, something about that detail stuck. Because it wasn't just any scarf. She said it had patches on it, threaded shapes, like it had once belonged to a scout or a club. Rains followed the thread and checked through regional reports of missing persons with scouting backgrounds. Nothing panned out, but what it triggered was a new idea. If the group seen that day wasn't random, and if they'd waited until other campers left to act, then maybe this wasn't just opportunity. Maybe it was a plan. The LA family's account was re-examined. The man, the woman, and the second man, taller, quiet, the one who kept glancing up the road. Rains had always thought of them as connected to Dwayne Little, but this time he started looking at them as their own unit. 3 people, moving together, acting deliberately. And that's when he dug up a piece of the file no one had given proper weight to. A miner's statement filed in pencil on a lined yellow form dated 3 days after Labor Day. A teenage boy, 16 at the time, had reported that a man and woman stopped by his grandfather's old trapper's cabin to ask for water. He remembered them because they didn't knock. They just opened the screen and walked in like it was theirs. Said the man's boots were muddy, like he'd been off trail, and the woman had red knuckles like she'd punched something. The boy had shrugged it off back then, thought maybe they were just hikers who got lost. But now it added another shape to what Rains had been circling. He started pulling motor vehicle logs from the nearest county. One name stood out, not Dwayne Little's, but his father's, Edward Little. He'd sold a truck just 6 weeks after the Daltons disappeared. A dark blue 1959 Chevy pickup with a deep dent in the passenger panel. The same one described by the LA family. That detail wasn't enough to indict anybody, but it connected Dwayne to the vehicle. And more importantly, it connected him to other people. People who hadn't been named yet. And that's when Rains did something he rarely did. He reached out to an old contact at the state prison, someone who worked in offender programs and had occasionally debriefed inmates for behavioral risk assessment. His name was Mark Giddens, a former profiler. Rains handed over the full timeline, the statements, the cave photos, and asked one question. Is this the work of one man? Giddens reviewed it over a week. His answer wasn't dramatic. Just careful. If it is, he said, then he's unusually patient, unusually lucky, and unusually strong. He paused. But it reads more like a shared task. Division of labor. One distracts, one transports, one watches. Then he added, and the woman wasn't passive. I think she was central. That suggestion pulled Rains in a new direction. He started asking questions about Dwayne Little's past, who he associated with, who he dated, who visited him during his early parole. That's how he found the name Bonnie Jean Laramie. Bonnie had a quiet record. No arrests, but a few loitering charges in Southern Oregon and a car theft accusation in 1972 that never stuck. She'd lived off and on in Josephine County sometimes with her sister, sometimes alone. What stood out wasn't her rap sheet, it was her proximity. She'd lived just 4 miles from where the Dalton family vanished. Her rental records placed her there from July to October of that year. Then she moved south toward Cave Junction. Raines had never interviewed her. He drove out that same week. Bonnie was 57 by then, working part-time at a laundromat and living in a small trailer off a forest road. She looked surprised to see him, but not alarmed. Said she hadn't thought about Dwayne Little in years. When asked if she'd ever been to Carberry Creek, she hesitated. Said she used to go berry picking out there, then said she wasn't sure. When asked if she'd ever owned a green scarf with badges, she smiled and said no, but her cousin used to sew patches on everything. She offered him sweet tea and asked if she was in trouble. Raines told her she wasn't. Not yet. Back at the office, he requested another scan of the cave area. Not for evidence there wasn't any left, but for objects. Bits of fabric plastic boot tread. The team found something wedged between a boulder and the base of a pine about 20 feet from where Rick had been tied. It was a button. Old chipped, engraved with the letters RJR, an abbreviation common on scout uniforms from the 1960s. Too damaged to match directly to anyone, but still, a clue. Word of the discovery spread fast. The sheriff's office didn't name names, but people drew their own conclusions. Bonnie stopped showing up to work, moved again, disconnected her phone. When Raines followed up, she was gone. No forwarding address. What stayed with me through all of that wasn't the evidence. It was the pattern. Whoever killed the Daltons hadn't done it on impulse. They waited. They planned. They weren't afraid of proximity. They used it. They watched us search and walk the same paths. Maybe even helped. They knew which days we'd show up with dogs and which days the trails would be empty. And they waited for the silence. That's what stuck. And that button, the one tucked under a stone, no more useful than a bottle cap, was the only piece they'd missed. Or maybe just maybe the one they chose to leave. A warning, or an invitation. That fall, a new report came in from a survey crew clearing brush near the southern boundary of the national forest. They found something that didn't belong. A shallow dip in the ground. A rusted tin lunchbox buried under flat stones. Inside was a torn photograph, and the edges didn't match anything we knew. But the face on that picture, whoever it belonged to, looked like someone we might have seen before. And that meant the story wasn't finished. Not yet. The lunchbox itself was nothing special. Old dented the kind with a rounded top and faded plaid sticker peeling from one side. The survey crew found it by accident while clearing overgrowth near the southern edge of the Siskiyou boundary. It was wedged under a tangle of root and shale, maybe 10 yards from an old game trail that hadn't seen use in years. The metal was rusted through in one corner, but it hadn't fully collapsed. Inside, tucked beneath a thin film of mold and time, was a single photograph. Torn on one edge, edges curled. It showed a man and a woman standing side by side near what looked like a fishing dock. The woman had a scarf tied around her head, green patterned, the same kind of scarf described by the LA campers from all those months ago. The man wasn't immediately recognizable. His eyes were partly closed, jaw turned slightly. But his build, the shape of his mouth, it triggered something. Rains didn't say much when he got the call. Just drove out, took the photo from the evidence bag, and held it against the gray light. He brought it back to the station and placed it alongside the booking photo of Dwayne Little. The resemblance wasn't perfect, but it was close enough. That same week, the department received a second tip, this time from a retired corrections officer who used to work at the facility where Dwayne had served part of his sentence before his second conviction. The officer, Harold Browning, said he remembered Dwayne getting regular visits from an older woman and a younger man, both of whom never gave full names. Said they came up from Southern Oregon, stayed only 10 or 15 minutes, never talked much. The woman always wore a headscarf, even indoors. Said the younger man walked with a slight limp. None of this had ever been noted before because the visitors had registered under first names only. But after hearing about the Dalton case in a true crime article his daughter had sent him, Browning started wondering. And once he saw the photo released with the lunchbox discovery he called in, he was nearly certain the woman in the picture matched the one who used to visit Dwayne. Rains tracked the visitor logs from the prison looking for any record of a Bonnie Jean Laramie. There were none. But there were visits logged under Jeannie Lowell during the same years Bonnie was living near Cave Junction. The address she used, a vacant property later tied to one of Dwayne's cousins. All of this was circumstantial. No confession, no fingerprint, no recorded vehicle plates. But when you stacked it beside the cave, the placement of the bodies, the LA family's description, and the cabin guest book, the story started holding weight. It was enough for Rains to request a formal interview with Dwayne. He was serving 3 life terms at Snake River Correctional, not expected to ever be paroled. He hadn't spoken about the Dalton case since the jailhouse informant Rusty Kelly claimed he'd made an offhand confession back in 1980. Even then, it hadn't been recorded, just a man trying to trade one truth for a better sentence. But Rains didn't care about confession. He was looking for reaction. He drove out there himself, sat across from Dwayne in a bare interview room under buzzing fluorescent lights. He brought the photo from the lunchbox, slid it across the table. Dwayne didn't touch it, just looked at it for a long moment, then leaned back in his chair. "Never seen her," he said, voice flat, no movement in his eyes. Rains nodded once, picked the photo back up, and said nothing. Then he asked about Labor Day weekend 1974. Asked if Dwayne had been in White Pine. Dwayne said he couldn't remember. Too long ago. Asked if he knew the trails around Carberry Creek. "Used to hunt," he said. "Nothing more." Rains stood to leave, but before he reached the door, Dwayne said something that didn't fit. "You ever think some folks go missing because they want to?" It wasn't a question. Just a sentence dropped like a coin on a table. The next week, the department issued a public statement confirming that no new charges were being filed in the Dalton case. But they acknowledged new evidence had reopened the timeline. The sheriff called it an evolving investigation. For Belinda, it didn't change anything. She came by the station a few days later, not to ask questions, just to bring a small stack of cards she'd found in a drawer, David's old drawings. One of them showed the family tent drawn in crayon. A little green square with yellow lines and stick figures smiling beside it. Rains took the drawing, thanked her, and placed it in the file. The truth was, there wasn't going to be a clean resolution. Not the kind people wait for in stories like this. No courtroom, no fingerprints, no voice raised in admission. But there was one final piece that Rains hadn't shared publicly. It came from the photo itself. Under infrared analysis, they discovered faint handwriting along the bottom edge, barely visible to the naked eye. A date almost rubbed out. Sep 2, 74. The day after the Daltons disappeared. The implication was clear. Whoever had that lunchbox had been nearby, had watched, or waited, or come back afterward. That lunchbox wasn't buried deep. It was left in a place where someone might find it eventually, which meant maybe it wasn't forgotten. Maybe it was a reminder. I went back to the ridge not long after, just to stand near the trailhead where everything had started. The wind was sharp that morning, pines shifting like they were carrying something. The ground felt colder than it should have for September. I didn't go far, just looked out across the tree line and tried to picture what the Daltons saw that weekend. How normal it must have felt, how familiar, until it wasn't. That's the part that stays with me, not the violence, not even the silence. Just the moment right before it all shifted, when the milk was still on the table, when the dog was still tied to the tree, when no one had run yet, because they didn't know they needed to. And in that space, in the pause between safety and what followed someone else, was already moving, already watching, already deciding what would come next. The first thing I remember was the milk, still on the table lid, flipped open like someone had paused mid-pour and never came back. The sun had already warmed the clearing, but that milk hadn't curdled yet. It hadn't been long. There were no sounds, no shouts, no dragging footprints. Just a campsite full of life food toys, diapers without a single person in sight. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from, down in the comments, and tap that like and subscribe if stories like this ever brushed past your hometown or your own life. Every click helps pull another forgotten name back into the light. My name's Karen McBride. I'm 42 now, and I've lived in White Pine, Oregon nearly my whole life. Back in '74, my husband Gary and I had just moved into a small one-story house about 3 blocks from the Daltons. Rick worked long hours driving logging trucks through the mountains. Jenny stayed home with the kids, David and baby Lena. You'd see her out early pushing that old stroller along Applewood Lane, waving at folks she barely knew. Quiet, polite, kept to herself mostly, but kind. Rick was the type to change your tire without asking. He'd nod instead of talk, but if you needed help moving a couch or hauling firewood, he was already on his way before you finished the sentence. They didn't have much, just that old red pickup, a swing in the front yard, and a backyard patch where David played with the neighbor kids. But they were solid. That summer, they were more settled than ever. Jenny had just turned 23, and she'd finally gotten a little ahead on the grocery money. I remember she baked banana bread and brought some over wrapped in a dish towel. Said she'd gotten the recipe from her mother, wanted to share. That's just the kind of woman she was. Every few weeks, Rick would get a long weekend off, and they'd head out to Carberry Creek to camp. Same spot every time, off a bend in the trail near the tree line, just where the sound of the water picked up again. Rick loved to fish, and David would toss rocks until his arms were sore. Jenny packed egg salad sandwiches, a jug of lemonade, sometimes homemade cookies. They didn't bring much, just a tent, some folding chairs, and the dog, but they didn't need more. That Labor Day weekend started the same as all the others. I saw them loading up on Friday, David clutching his toy airplane, Jenny waving goodbye with her baby on her hip. Buddy barked from the truck bed, full of energy. I didn't think much of it. Why would I? They always came back by Sunday night tired, but smiling, sunburned, and happy. But this time, Monday came. Then Tuesday. No truck in the driveway. No Jenny pushing the stroller. No sign of David chasing the neighbor's cat through the hedge. It wasn't until Wednesday morning that her mother showed up at my door, eyes wide, holding a half-folded paper grocery list she said Jenny left behind. She said, "Karen, something's wrong. They didn't show up for dinner." And she wasn't the type to worry without a reason. We drove out there that afternoon. I still remember how quiet the woods were when we stepped into the clearing, like the trees were holding their breath. Rick's truck was parked just off the road like always. The fire pit was cold but tidy. Picnic basket still open. Milk still on the table. And the dog still tied to the tree. But no sign of the family. Not a single one of them. Not even footprint.